There we go. Welcome to week 3. This is my video lecture on Aristotle, the excerpt from the Rhetoric. Give you a little bit of background. In ancient Greece, between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, a form of political governance arose called democracy. It required the citizens to play a direct role in making important decisions like whether to go to war or not, to raise or lower taxes, to build bridges or walls, to convict or acquit citizens accused of crimes against the state or against other citizens. Eventually, the citizens gained the right to speak in the assembly when the population became large enough to justify an elected representative body. A group of professionally trained speakers was drafted to introduce legislation and issues at the gathering of the assembly. These men were called rhetors. Eventually, this term became synonymous with someone who's skilled in public speaking. All citizens of the state were able to attend schools where the principles of rhetoric were taught. These skills were thought to be essential to citizens' duty to be able to make informed decisions, resolve disputes, and mediate public issues. We still study rhetoric today because a person who understands the principles of rhetoric can critically evaluate arguments and be free from the manipulative power of language. In ancient times, it was understood that people would necessarily disagree on many issues, partly because language can as easily cloud an issue as it can make it clear. Also, ancient citizens understood that the art of rhetoric was an essentially practical skill that was useful in their day-to-day affairs, and that rhetoric was always considered within the context of the issue, the speaker, and the audience. This is the so-called rhetorical triangle. Some of you have heard of the communications triangle, or rhetorical context. Aristotle, who lived from 384 BC to 322 BCE, was one of the most well-regarded of the ancient teachers of rhetoric. He studied at Plato's Academy for 20 years between the ages of 18 and 38. It was not until his 40s and 50s that he wrote most of his great works, categorizing the knowledge of the times in fields from physics to poetics. The excerpt from the Rhetoric that we are reading in the dialogues is exhaustive in the style of writing that Aristotle uses. He introduces a topic, defines its use, and provides many examples as a way of instructing the reader. Aristotle begins by defining rhetoric in opposition to dialectic. Dialectic is the procedure or discourse established in the Greek schools, made famous by the Platonic dialogues, to establish the truth of some issue by a back-and-forth questioning and response that uses reason and evidence and examines the underlying warrants or assumptions of any claim or assertion. This type of procedure resists any argument that appeals to emotion or character. Aristotle thought that rhetoric was different than this kind of procedure because it took into account the immediate real context of the people engaged in the argument, people who would be subject to emotional appeals and not just logical ones. He categorizes those three appeals as 1, the appeal to reason, or logos, 2, the appeal to emotion, or pathos, and finally 3, the appeal to the character of the speaker, or ethos. Next, Aristotle addresses where these types of appeals might be made. In the first case, it might be a judicial instance where someone has been accused of something. The second context is the deliberative context, where a decision must be made and the types of possible actions or responses must be considered along with their possible consequences. And thirdly, the epideitic context. This is the situation where something or someone is to be blamed or praised. Now, Aristotle criticizes the other schools for not emphasizing the role of enthymemes in argumentation. Today we may understand part of the idea of enthymeme from the word meme, that is used as a description of an idea that has gone viral or has become part of our popular culture and language. The way Aristotle uses the term is to define a particular kind of logical argument structure known as a syllogism. This is a three-part argument structure, the famous one being all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is not perhaps the best example because the point Aristotle is making about enthymemes, and they're important in persuasion, is that the first term or premise must be always debatable or probable rather than a certainty. Perhaps the better example would be Socrates is a man. A better enthematic, a better enthymeme would be Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is masculine. See, this is an enthymeme that leaves off the first term or underlying premise that certainly bears argumentation that all men are masculine. The excerpt discusses a number of related concepts to the main categories of Aristotle's divisions of the elements and modes of rhetoric. But I think for the purpose of our course on belief and reason, one of the best justifications for studying Aristotle refers to Aristotle's conviction that the study of rhetoric is associated with ethics and politics, where issues of truth and justice are essential to the good of the person and the community. But in order to argue for the good of a person or a community, speakers must necessarily use certain premises as to what constitutes the good, and these are necessarily arguable premises about the nature of happiness and what the good means in any particular situation. Many of the examples that Aristotle cites are from classical stories that influenced the culture of his own time and were well understood by his contemporary readers. In order to build our own arguments, we would be well advised to become aware of as many of these rhetorical principles as we can so that we might be more effective, more persuasive, and more convincing in the arguments that we make in our discussion board postings and our essays, and also to become better critics of the arguments that surround us in our own culture. Will I really be happier driving a Toyota? Or is there really an effective role for me to play in the political process in our own country? What would that look like? What about the organizations and clubs that I belong to? How will I be able to contribute my talents and interests? Rhetoric offers principles of invention that will allow us to create the ways to speak and write ourselves into the roles that we'll play in our own lives. I'd like you to be familiar with the following terms: rhetoric, rhetorical context, kairos, that's spelled K-A-I-R-O-S, dialectic, discourse, syllogism, and enthymeme. And so take a look at those terms, take a look at the reading, do the best you can in it, watch this lecture, make notes, get on the discussion board, and I'll see you in class. Thanks.